You're wasting your life rehearsing tragedies that are never going to happen. And worse, you're doing it every single day, with conviction, thinking that's intelligence. Look inward for a second. How many times today have you already imagined a bad scenario that doesn't even exist yet? How many messages have you reread looking for some hidden intention that probably isn't there? How many times has your body tensed up over a future invented inside your own head? Carl Jung, one of the greatest names in analytical psychology, identified this pattern as a clear symptom of disconnection from the self. For him, the repeated act of living while expecting disaster, of doubting every path that opens up, reveals a silent state of self-abandonment, a soul that has lost contact with its own center and tries, through the mind, to control what could only ever be crossed through the heart. The first thing that needs to be said is that this invisible prison of everyday fear isn't weakness, nor a character flaw. It's an ancient psychic pattern, trained over generations, that has settled so deep into the unconscious that most people confuse this state with their own personality. They say things like, "That's just how I am, I've always been anxious, I was born worried." And right there, in that seemingly simple sentence, surrender lives. The person hands their entire life over to a pattern they didn't even choose. They hand over a job that hasn't even started. They hand over a relationship that doesn't even exist yet. They hand over the entire future as if it already came decided. Jung wrote in one of his denser works, The Ego and the Unconscious, originally published in 1928, that modern man is dominated by forces he doesn't understand. And the sentence sounds heavy, but think about it for a moment. How many decisions did you make today out of a fear you don't even know the origin of? That hesitation before sending a message, that backing off when it was time to ask for something, that stiff smile for someone you don't even want around anymore. All of that is the unconscious working in silence, writing the script of your life while you think you're improvising. I know it's hard to hear this, because it means admitting there's a layer inside you that you don't control. But it's precisely this recognition that opens the first door, and without that door, nothing that comes after will make sense. To understand why we live expecting things to go wrong, we have to go back long before your personal story, back before your childhood, before your parents, before your grandparents. The collective unconscious, a concept Jung described in the archetypes and the collective unconscious, is a deep layer of the psyche that carries memories and patterns of the entire species. Imagine centuries of famine, of wars, of harsh winters, of incurable diseases, of families torn apart by violence. Each of those experiences left an invisible groove on the human mind, and that groove was passed down, generation after generation, like an instruction written in invisible ink inside every child who is born. The instruction is simple: expect the worst, because the worst has already happened many times. This defensive mode was useful when survival was literal, when there were predators in the dark, when the next meal wasn't guaranteed. But today, in the 21st century, with food at the supermarket and light at the flick of a switch, this mode is still running, except now it shows up in other ways. It shows up in the credit card bill that arrives by email and makes your stomach lock up, in the blue glow of the phone on your face at 3 in the morning, while you replay the conversation you had with your boss, in the bumper-to-bumper traffic, where your thoughts are already constructing the scenario of what could go wrong over the weekend, in the grocery store line, where you calculate how much will be left until the end of the month, and your whole body tenses up. You've confused surviving with living, and the body pays the price. It's completely valid to feel this, because it isn't being dramatic, it's inheritance. And the first step to freeing yourself from an inheritance that no longer serves you is, above all else, to recognize it exists and that it isn't yours. You weren't born anxious, you were taught to be. And what was taught can be unlearned and learned again. But there's something even deeper happening inside you at this very moment. Something that's going to change the way you see yourself. And I'll show you in a little while. Before that, we need to cross through a concept Jung brought forward that is, perhaps, the most disturbing and the most liberating in-depth psychology: the shadow. Inside every human being, there is a region where all the parts they considered unacceptable were pushed. The anger they couldn't show as a child, the desire they learned to hide out of fear of rejection, the longings that family or religion condemned, the ambition that got confused with sin, the scream that got confused with bad manners. None of that disappears. It just goes to the bottom. And there, in the dark, it takes on a life of its own. The shadow is like a locked room inside the house of the psyche. And when a person doesn't open that door, they start projecting the contents of that room outward, in the form of fear of the future, in the form of distrust of people, in the form of imagined catastrophes that never happen but feel too real to ignore, in the form of harsh judgment of others, which is really the judgment you can't bear to look at inside yourself. What you fear might happen out there is often an internal photograph being projected onto the screen of the future. You're not seeing the world, you're seeing your shadow drawn onto it. Think about someone who has an intense fear of being cheated on. They'll read every gesture from their partner as suspicious. They'll interpret every late arrival as confirmation. They'll dig through messages, build narratives, assemble internal evidence. And if that fear is, in reality, a projection of a part of them that was marked by an old experience that was never truly looked at, they'll produce, inside the relationship, the exact climate they fear most. Not because the other person is going to cheat, but because a climate of constant distrust erodes any bond. And when the bond collapses, they say, "I knew it," when in fact, they were the one who quietly built the conditions for the collapse. That's the silent mechanism of the shadow. It creates, without you realizing, exactly what you fear, and then it convinces you that you were a victim of chance. Looking at the shadow is work that few people do, because it requires an honesty that hurts before it sets you free. It requires recognizing that inside you there is an envious part, an angry part, a selfish part, an ambitious part, a manipulative part, a wounded part, and not to identify with it, but to stop being secretly commanded by it. What you recognize, you integrate. What you integrate stops governing you. And that's why two people can live through the same situation and have completely different perceptions. One sees opportunity, the other sees threat. The difference isn't in the facts. It's in what each one carries in their internal basement. It's in the room each one refused to open. Jung had a line that crossed through time and still dismantles entire minds today. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. Pause for a second and let that sink in. Everything you think is happening to you might actually be happening because of you. Not out of blame, not out of punishment, but out of a pattern repeated so many times it became invisible. The person who always attracts relationships that end badly. The person who always finds bosses who undervalue them. The person who always sees the same scene repeat, in different settings, with different characters. It isn't a curse, it's a pattern. And the pattern lives in a place inside her that she hasn't visited yet. I completely understand when you think, so it's my fault. But no, it isn't blame. Blame is a word that paralyzes. It's responsibility. And responsibility is a word that liberates. Because everything you're responsible for, you can also change. Everything you discover inside yourself stops governing you from the dark. And changing starts with one single thing: looking inward with the same honesty you look outward, maybe even more. Because it's easier to judge the world than to examine yourself. It's more comfortable to point out the flaws in others than to acknowledge your own. It's simpler to complain than to transform. Now think about the price you pay, every day, for living in a permanent state of protection. The human body wasn't built for continuous hypervigilance. The nervous system enters silent burnout when it has to always be ready for attack. And what looks, from the outside, like just tiredness or stress, is actually a soul calling for help in a way ordinary language can't translate. Jung described neurosis as the suffering of a soul that hasn't found its meaning. Read that again. It's not the suffering of someone who lost something. It's the suffering of someone who hasn't yet found what they came here to do. And most people live with that emptiness without even knowing it has a name. They think it's just a phase. They think it'll pass. They think it's the end of the year, it's work, it's hormones, it's accumulated tiredness. They go to the doctor, get tests, receive diagnoses that treat the symptom but don't touch the root. But the truth is, there's an existential hunger no plate fills. And the more a person tries to smother that hunger with distraction, with consumption, with information overload, the deeper it goes. The person buys more, posts more, works more, drinks more, watches more, and stays empty. Because the hunger isn't from the body, it's for meaning. Jung observed, in various texts, that many of the people who came to him in the middle of life weren't sick in the traditional sense. They were, in fact, in a disorientation of meaning. They had achieved everything the culture told them to achieve: house, job, family, stability. And even then they woke up with that tightness in the chest, with that urge to cry for no clear reason, with that sense of living someone else's life inside their own body. He called this the task of the second half of life, the task of finding within yourself what cannot be filled by anything external. And this task today is arriving earlier and earlier. It's not at 50 anymore. It's at 30, at 25, at 20, because the acceleration of modern life has compressed the timeline of everything, including the existential crisis. Younger people are arriving already exhausted because they've consumed, since childhood, more images, more expectations, more demands than any previous generation could absorb. The tiredness you feel, and maybe never managed to explain to anyone, has an address inside you. It lives at the exact point where your soul stopped being heard. And as long as you don't answer that internal call, everything else weighs heavy. Work weighs heavy. Relationships weigh heavy. Sundays weigh heavy. Even rest becomes a task, because you're trying to rest the body while the soul is still standing, waiting for you to finally listen. Waiting for you to finally recognize that the problem was never the full schedule, but the wrong schedule, full of things that aren't yours, empty of the things that would be. The good news, and it exists, is that this internal point doesn't get lost. It just gets covered, and what's been covered can be dug up, slowly, layer by layer, with a patience modern life barely allows, but which is still possible for those who decide to look. Hold on to that idea, because it'll make complete sense when I explain the next concept. Here we reach the moment when maybe you think, okay, but living as if everything will work out is kind of naive, isn't it? How am I supposed to just trust when the world is the way it is? And that question is valid, because most people confuse two things that look the same but are opposites: naivety and inner faith. Naivety is closing your eyes to reality. Inner faith is opening your eyes to a wider reality. Naivety is denying fear. If inner faith is moving through fear without being commanded by it. Naivety is saying everything's fine when it isn't. Inner faith is saying that even when things aren't fine, there's something inside you capable of transforming what seems impossible into a passage. Nietzsche touched on this same territory with the expression amor fati, love your fate. Not in the sense of passively accepting what happens, but in the sense of embracing life with such wholeness that even the falls become part of the path and not an interruption of it. Jung was in dialogue with this idea when he spoke of active acceptance. To accept isn't to give up, it's to stop fighting against what is, in order to start transforming what can be. When you live expecting the worst, you are, without realizing, at war with life. And no one wins a war against their own existence. You only wear yourself out inside it. You only grow older inside it. You only lose the days inside it, without ever having truly lived them. I'm not saying this to leave you in anguish, but to wake you up. Because there's a huge difference between being awake and just reacting. Most people spend decades reacting, and they confuse reacting with living. They react to the alarm clock. They react to traffic. They react to the boss's message. They react to the grocery bill. They react to a relative's comment at Sunday lunch. And at the end of the day, they feel like they lived, when really they were just pushed along by a sequence of events. And it's exactly at this point that one of the most beautiful concepts Jung recovered from universal myth tradition appears: the archetype of the hero. In every culture, in every era, the same silent narrative exists: a call, a resistance, a crossing, a transformation. The hero isn't the brave character who was born ready. He's the ordinary person who received an internal invitation, and after much hesitation, decided to answer. This invitation arrives for everyone, at different moments, in different forms. Sometimes it comes as a dissatisfaction that won't go away, sometimes as a recurring dream, sometimes as a tiredness that seems out of proportion with what you do, sometimes as a sudden urge to change something you can't even name, sometimes as an illness that forces you to stop, sometimes as a loss that forces you to reorganize everything. That's the call. In the archetypes and the collective unconscious, Jung describes how this hero pattern repeats in mythologies across every continent, in every era. From Ulysses' journey in the Odyssey, to Buddha's path leaving the palace, to the journey of religious and cultural figures from ancient traditions. Always the same blueprint: a comfortable life, an inner call, an initial resistance, a crossing, a descent into the unknown, and the transformed return, bringing back something of value for oneself and for others. This pattern repeats because it isn't cultural, it's psychic, it's a deep mold of the human soul. And when you feel at some point in life that there's something inside you asking for movement, you're feeling the echo of that archetype awakening. And most people refuse, not out of cowardice, but because the unknown is more frightening than familiar dissatisfaction. You prefer the suffering you know to the relief whose shape you don't yet know. And so you keep going. One more day, one more month, one more year, one more entire decade slipping between your fingers. One more birthday where you blow out the candle thinking, maybe next year will be different, and it isn't. Living while expecting the worst is, in symbolic terms, refusing the call. It's looking at the door that opened and saying, not today, maybe tomorrow, maybe when I'm more prepared, maybe when things are calmer. And things are never calmer, because calm doesn't come from the outside. It comes from inside, whoever decided to cross. Pause here for a second. Think about how many calls you've already refused, and how many are still waiting. What comes next? The part that bothers people the most when they hear it for the first time. So take a deep breath. When someone finally accepts the call, the hardest part of the journey arrives: the crossing. Jung said that no one becomes enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. That line should be carved on the walls of every psychology school, because it dismantles the modern spiritual fantasy, the one where the person wants to transform themselves without entering their own darkness. They want light without shadow. They want healing without the wound. They want to reach the other side without crossing the river. The crossing requires trusting before you can see the other shore. And that's the opposite of everything the rational mind learns. The mind wants evidence. It wants proof. It wants guarantees. But real transformation gives no guarantees. It asks for a step into the dark. It asks for the courage to move without knowing where you'll land. It asks you to leave the safe shore without knowing if the other shore actually exists. And this is where a lot of people give up. Not from lack of ability, but from lack of trust. Trust isn't born from outside. It's born from within, and it's only born in those willing to truly see themselves. That's why fear of the future is, deep down, fear of your own transformation. Because to transform means to die a little of who you were. And the ego, that character you built with so much effort, doesn't want to die. It resists. It invents reasons. It creates elegant justifications. It says now isn't the time, that the conditions aren't right, that there isn't enough security, that there's no clear sign. Speaking of the ego, there's a specific structure Jung called the persona. The persona is the mask you wear to move through the world. It's the character who goes to work. It's the child who calls their mother. It's the friend at gatherings. It's the professional at the office. It's the friendly person in the elevator. Everyone has a persona, and that's fine. The problem begins when a person identifies so much with the mask that they forget the face. When that happens, any change feels like a threat, because the mask only survives in a predictable scenario. If the scenario changes, the mask starts to crack, and the person interprets that crack as a catastrophe, when in reality, it's an invitation to rediscover the face the mask was hiding, an invitation to stop performing and start living. A lot of people live distrusting life because they built such a rigid identity that any movement feels like collapse. They live holding on to a version of themselves that no longer fits, and the harder they try to hold on, the more tired they become. Because keeping a mask intact is one of the most exhausting tasks there is. You're pretending, every day, to be someone who might not even exist anymore. You're displaying on social media a narrative that doesn't match what's actually in your chest. You're answering everything's fine to questions that deserved an honest answer. Living as if everything will work out requires loosening that mask, not throwing it away, but loosening it, allowing the face underneath to breathe, allowing something real to start showing through, even if that truth doesn't have a name yet, even if it contradicts everything others expected of you, even if it demands changes that will make people close to you uncomfortable. And when you start doing this, something curious happens. Life starts responding in a different way. It isn't coincidence. It's what Jung called synchronicity. In synchronicity, and a causal connecting principle, Jung described how certain events, which seem random, actually carry deep meaning for those who experience them. You think of someone and that person calls. You're searching for an answer, and you open a book to exactly the right page. You feel the impulse to do something different, and right there, you find the opportunity that would change everything. It isn't magic, it's alignment. When the inner posture changes, the filter through which you read reality also changes. And things that had always been around you start showing up for the first time. Not because they appeared out of nowhere, but because before, you didn't have eyes to see them. The opportunity was there, the path was there, the right person was there. But you were operating with such a thick filter of fear that everything seemed like a threat or like indifference. Synchronicity is the way the psyche signals that you're walking in the right direction. It's the silent sign of the inner universe responding to the outer universe. And the more aligned you are with yourself, with your deepest center, the more these signs show up. But careful, synchronicity isn't control. It isn't placing orders like life is a catalog. It's recognizing that there's a greater intelligence moving through you, and that this intelligence shows itself when you stop trying to manipulate everything. When you let go of the wheel with that clenched hand that insists on forcing outcomes that haven't ripened yet. Now we arrive at the heart of this path, the process Jung considered the most important task of human life. Individuation. That strange word describes something extremely simple, and at the same time extremely deep. Becoming who you are. It sounds obvious, but it isn't. Most people live being who they were trained to be, who their family expected, who school demanded, who the job market required, who society approved of, who their partner wanted, who their friends praised. And at 50, they look in the mirror and realize they lived an entire life without knowing themselves. They fulfilled every role except the most important one. They were everyone except themselves. Individuation is the opposite of that path. It's the slow and courageous process of discovering what inside you is yours and what is mask, what is your own voice and what is an echo, what is true desire and what is inherited desire, what is a calling and what is programming, what is real love and what is just the wish to not be alone. And here it's important to clarify something a lot of people confuse. Individuation isn't individualism. It isn't isolating yourself. It isn't becoming a cold person who only cares about themselves. On the contrary, the more a person individuates, the more they can relate to others in a genuine way, because they stop using others as mirrors of their own identity. They stop demanding that their partner complete them. They stop pressuring their parents to approve of them. They stop searching their friends for an audience for their mask. They start relating from wholeness and not from neediness. The non-individuated person lives needing validation. They live in small, invisible dependencies. They need the boss to praise them. They need the friend to agree. They need the photo to get likes. They need the partner to confirm. And this chain of small dependencies consumes the energy they could be using to create, to love, to transform themselves. The individuated person doesn't depend. They choose. And when they choose to be with someone, it's because they want to, not because they need to. If you're enjoying this content, check out the first comment for our exclusive ebook, Alchemy and Archetypes. And it's precisely in this process that real trust is born. The trust that everything will work out. Because that trust no longer depends on external circumstances. It doesn't depend on the economy improving. It doesn't depend on the right person showing up. It doesn't depend on everything going wrong, so it can later go right. The trust is born from inner unity, from knowing, somewhere deep, that even if everything out there collapses, there is still a center inside you that doesn't collapse. That center has a name. Jung called it the self. And here's an important warning for the journey. There's a silent danger in modern life, and almost no one talks about it. The danger of living through the collective mind. Jung had a huge concern about the massification of the psyche. He noticed that the further a human being moves from their own interiority, the more they become a hostage to the thinking of the herd. And the thinking of the herd today is one of the most dangerous places on the planet. A person wakes up and the first thing they do is check the news. They receive ready-made fears for the entire day. Before coffee, they've already absorbed tragedies from 4 different continents. Before lunch, they've already formed opinions on subjects they haven't researched themselves. Before night, they're already exhausted from carrying the emotional weight of an entire humanity inside their own nervous system. And even then, they can't sleep, because the nervous system, now saturated, can't shut off. That isn't information, it's overload. And the result of that daily overload is a psyche that can no longer hear its own voice. Everything inside it is an echo. Echo of a headline, echo of an algorithm, echo of someone else's opinion, echo of collective fear, echo of a trend, echo of a discourse it repeats, without knowing where it came from. Stepping out of that field is the first act of psychic autonomy. It isn't being uninformed. It's protection. It's choosing, with clarity, what enters your mind and what doesn't. Because what enters the mind becomes thought. What becomes thought becomes feeling. What becomes feeling becomes action. And what becomes action becomes destiny. You are building your destiny every day by what you allow to live inside your head. And a lot of people don't even know that. They think destiny is an external force, when, in reality, it's being written right now, in real time, by the thoughts you're repeating without noticing, by the videos you watch while you eat, by the conversations you take part in out of habit, by the stories you tell yourself, about yourself, dozens of times a day, without realizing that each repetition is carving a deeper groove, coming back to the self, which is the most important point of this whole journey. The self, for Jung, is the regulating center of the psyche. It's something bigger than the ego. It's as if inside you there is a silent wisdom that knows things your rational mind hasn't been able to understand yet. It's that part that, in moments of crisis, tells you it's going to be okay, even when logic swears the opposite. It's that part that, in moments of choice, pulls you toward the path that seems harder, but later reveals itself as the right one. It's that part that, on certain nights, wakes you up with a calm certainty that something needs to change. Most people live disconnected from the self. They live through the head, through reasoning, through running the numbers, and that disconnection is exactly what produces the feeling of living on autopilot. You're doing everything, but you're in nothing. You're everywhere, but you aren't in yourself. You're having a conversation, but you aren't present. You're hugging, but you aren't feeling. You're living, but you aren't being touched by what you live. Reconnecting with the self means abandoning excessive mental control. It means allowing something deeper than reason to start guiding you. It isn't abandoning intelligence. It's integrating the intelligence of the mind with the wisdom of the soul. When those two start walking together, trust shows up naturally, without effort, without forced positive affirmations, without repeating motivational lines in the mirror. The trust appears because it is, in fact, the natural state of someone who is aligned. And that trust isn't a certainty. It's a movement. That's one of the great modern delusions. People think they need to have certainty before they act, and they stand still their whole lives waiting for a certainty that never arrives. Life doesn't work like that. Life asks you to trust without a guarantee, to walk without a map, to love without a promise, to create without knowing if it will work. There's an abyss between who you are and who you're becoming, and no bridge will appear before the leap. The bridge forms while you're jumping. That's the secret no one tells you. You don't need to see the whole path. You only need to take the next step, and then the next, and then the next. And the path draws itself behind you, not in front of you. Trusting isn't certainty, it's movement. And only those who move make the crossing. Those who keep waiting for the perfect scenario grow old inside a scenario that never arrives. They wait for the right time. They wait to have more money. They wait to have more maturity. They wait to have more information. They wait and wait and wait. And life passes by while the waiting room stays full. Maybe you're asking yourself now, okay, but how do I actually do this in practice? How do I start stepping out of this pattern? And here are some directions which Jung worked on throughout his life and which still work today for those who apply them seriously. They aren't magic formulas, they're doors, and each door requires that you open it. The first is observing your own thoughts, not to judge them, just to see them. Like someone watching clouds pass across the sky. Most people are dominated by their own thoughts because they have never separated themselves from them. They don't realize that thought isn't reality. It's just an interpretation of reality. When you start observing instead of obeying, something shifts in your inner relationship. The thought loses its status as absolute truth. It becomes just a visitor. The second is reflective writing. Writing about yourself, about what you feel, about what you notice, about what you can't explain. Writing organizes the inner chaos. It turns sensation into word and word into awareness. Jung kept notebooks where he wrote down dreams, symbols, images, inner conversations, and the famous Red Book grew out of that habit over many years. You don't need to create a book, but you need to create a space, a simple notebook. 10 minutes a day, no rules, no judgment. Just the flow of what shows up when you sit down to listen to your own mind. The third is paying attention to dreams. Jung placed enormous value on dreams because he understood that there the unconscious speaks directly, without the filters waking life imposes. You don't need to interpret everything. Just write them down. Over time, patterns start showing up. And those patterns tell things about you that no rational analysis could translate. Characters that repeat. Settings that come back. Sensations that stay in the body even after you wake up. The fourth is daily silence. Even if it's just 10 minutes. Silence without a phone, without noise, without distraction. Just you, sitting, listening to what shows up when the external noise stops. At first it's uncomfortable. Later it becomes the most important moment of the day. Because it's there, in that silence, that the voice of the self can be heard. It doesn't shout, it whispers. And whispers don't cut through noise. The fifth is identifying patterns of fear. When fear shows up, instead of obeying it, ask it. Where do you come from? When was the first time I felt you? What are you protecting? That simple question begins to light up the inner basement. And what is lit up loses its strength. Because fear feeds on the darkness it operates in. When you turn on the light, it shrinks. These practices seem small, but real transformation is never grand. It's silent. It happens in layers. In small inner rituals that over time form a new psychic architecture. You won't feel the change on the first day, or in the first month, but one day, a few months from now, you'll notice you reacted differently to a situation that used to knock you down. And right there, in that instant, you'll understand that something has moved. Living as if everything will always work out isn't a self-help line. It's an existential stance. It's a posture toward life that is born from the alignment between who you are, what you feel, and what you do. It isn't naive optimism. It isn't a denial of reality. It isn't pretending everything is fine when it isn't. It's something much deeper. It's recognizing that life responds to each person's inner tone, that what you emanate consistently, day after day, shapes the kind of reality that comes closer to you. Not as magic, but as resonance. You attract what you vibrate with. And you vibrate with what you inhabit on the inside. Those who trust open paths. Those who fear closed doors. Not because the universe is fair or unfair, but because perception determines experience. And repeated experience determines life. Destiny, in the end, is always the reflection of a soul that allows itself to walk. You don't need to control everything. You just need to be aligned enough that whatever comes, you can cross through. And whatever hasn't come yet, you can wait for with patience, instead of anticipating it with anguish. If this reflection touched you in some way, if something inside you stirred while you were listening, leave your like, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, and come be part of our members club. where we go deeper into these themes in an even more intimate and transformative way. The path of individuation is long, but no one has to walk it alone. I'll be waiting for you there.